Let's continue our discussion of specialized defenses where a long history of selection has caused natural selection to shape a particular response to a particular environmental insult. The inflammatory response is activated both by infection and by injury. There are specialized cells in the immune system that coordinate inflammation, and inflammation maintains both tissue integrity and homeostasis. Those cells, the macrophages and the mast cells, detect the noxious stimuli and they produce inflammatory mediators, which are cytokines, chemokines, biogenic amines, leukotrienes, and prostaglandins. So there is a mix of chemicals that are secreted and act as signals to coordinate this response. The C fiber nociceptors, the pain receptors, produce neuropeptides to elicit a local inflammatory response to tissue injury. And at the expense of normal functions, these mediators act on the target tissues, inducing changes that defend against the noxious stimulus. The inflammatory mediators produce proteins that are involved in defense, in blood clotting, tissue repair, that suppress proteins that are involved in normal homeostasis and that change the homeostatic set points for body temperature and for appetite. These symptoms of sickness then result: fever, anorexia, fatigue, social withdrawal, sleepiness, and decreased sex drive. So the inflammatory response coordinates a defense reaction across a series of levels, from inside cells to communicating between cells to whole organism behavior. Inflammation is quite costly. There are many changes induced by acute inflammation that are the opposite of the fight or flight response, but some of them overlap. Inflammatory mediators suppress growth and reproduction, and they override homeostatic controls so that allocation goes towards survival functions. Inflammation is a high benefit trait that permits high costs in trade-offs and vulnerabilities. Acute inflammation can result in collateral damage and even an organ failure. At the extreme, this dysregulated acute inflammation can be deadly, as for example in septic shock, which results from infections in the blood. Dysregulated inflammation can also lead to diseases of homeostasis that are often elicited by mismatch, such as type 2 diabetes. Allergic defenses are another specialized defense. They operate in barrier tissues of the upper respiratory, gastrointestinal, and urogenital tracts. They respond to noxious substances such as venoms and irritants. The main defenses expel the substances and reinforce the barriers. So there's mucus production, runny nose, airway obstruction. I have a bit of that right now. Bronchoconstriction to prevent further exposure. Sneezing, coughing, vomiting, and diarrhea to get the noxious substances out of the body. Itching to remove substances from the skin. So these defenses have high costs and produce significant discomfort, and that discomfort protects by inducing behavioral avoidance. The discomfort teaches us to avoid these situations. Runny nose and vomiting, both ways of getting noxious substances out of the body. The detoxification response, a specialized defense, is used when we've been exposed to toxic environmental chemicals and they elicit a different kind of protective response. This response is based on metabolic modification and excretion of noxious chemicals. And much of it is mediated by two gene families that you are now already familiar with, those that are coding for N-acetyltransferases, NATs, and cytochrome P450s, CYPs. This is an ancient defense system. It protects from the harmful effect of reactive chemicals. It presumably evolved to defend us against phytochemicals, which plants use to defend themselves against herbivores. In the modern world, this is the system that provides protection from industrial pollutants and from toxic drug metabolites. Detoxification of metabolic byproducts is conceptually distinct from defense against environmental insults, but the two are mechanistically and evolutionarily related. Essentially, an ancient system used to defend us against nasty substances made by plants is used in the modern world both to defend us against industrial pollutants and other environmental insults, and also to process drugs. The innate immune response to infection is our first line of defense against pathogens. It is defending us against microbial infections and detects infection by recognizing conserved microbial products, such as lipopolysaccharides and peptidoglycans, that are unique and that are essential to microbes. So these molecules are a signal that a microbe is present, and they are not made by cells in our body. They can therefore be discriminated from self, and they ensure that pathogens do not evolve escape mutants, which would be crippled by the loss of essential molecules. So the innate immune system is looking for things that are unique to microbial pathogens and that microbial pathogens cannot do without. It can also detect infection indirectly by sensing the activities of virulence factors, toxins, and allergens. Innate immune recognition rapidly activates the inflammatory response, signaled here by conjunctivitis in a patient's eye, and other antimicrobial mechanisms, including phagocytosis, the complement system, a system of proteins that coats pathogens and aids immune cells in recognizing and digesting them, natural killer cells, and antibacterial defensins. So the antibacterial defensins are proteins that are secreted, and the innate immune response also has natural killer cells, which are a part of the immune system that is not triggered by the adaptive immune response. These are all things that can be ramped up fairly quickly. The innate immune system determines the origin of an antigen, that is, whether it is a virus, an extra or intracellular bacterium, or a eukaryote, like a fungus or something like malaria or the sleeping sickness pathogen, or a worm, and it produces a corresponding signal. So it identifies the kind of pathogen and signals then the adaptive immune system. That's why it is essential for activating the adaptive immune responses, because those immune responses differ with the type of pathogen. The adaptive immune system is mediated by T and B lymphocytes. T means that they matured in the thymus. B means they matured in the bone marrow. And the adaptive immune response is an extremely powerful defense system. It uses antigen receptors, antibodies, that are generated at random by somatic recombination, gene conversion, and random pairing of receptor subunits. So these different genetic mechanisms take the genetic heterogeneity, which is stored in families of these genes in our genome, and recombine them and associate them with particular clones of T and B cells. It's capable of making millions of antigen receptors, and one of them will be able to recognize any antigen. Lymphocytes with antigen receptors specific for microbial antigens are selected then to proliferate. This is the clonal selection process, generating clones of effector and memory cells. So this is a way of ramping up a very specific response by growing a huge population of cells, all of which are devoted to one particular antigen, which is associated with a particular pathogen. Because the antigen receptors are made at random, they cannot determine the origin of the antigens, whether that's self-tissue, microbial pathogen, or some innocuous environmental antigen. They must therefore be kept from reacting inappropriately to self and to harmless environmental antigens. So it's a very powerful system, but it contains a vulnerability because if it reacts with inappropriate tissue, it can cause autoimmune pathologies. This is the structure of an antibody. It is a Y-shaped molecule, protein molecule. It has a constant region with a heavy chain and a constant region in the light chain. And the action is going on out here at the tips, where you have the variable region of the light chain and the variable region of the heavy chain. And these are the segments which are being produced by genes that are highly polymorphic and that can be recombined to generate particular binding regions that will recognize particular antigens. Now, one of the powerful features of the adaptive immune response is that it creates a memory, so that after an initial exposure, the host can then be protected from subsequent infections coming from the same pathogen. And that allows subsequent responses to ramp up more quickly. And this is the basis of vaccination. So vaccination induces the production of a clone of cells that will be ready to react the next time the organism sees that particular antigen. Vaccines mimic infections, and they produce then this immunological memory that will protect. That defenses are modifications of processes that operate normally in the absence of a stressor might seem less obvious for immune defense, the detoxification response, and tissue repair. But in all of these cases, there is a non-defensive counterpart. The immune system manages the microbiota, and it manages tissue homeostasis. There is metabolic regulation for the detoxification system. And in the case of tissue repair, there is tissue renewal. So in all of these cases, the defense system is evolutionarily derived from a part of normal physiology. The exaggeration of each type of defense produces a characteristic associated disease.